Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. If you're a new listener, the focus of the show is to talk about socialist countries, past and present. We've covered socialist countries such as Laos, North Korea, Cuba, East Germany, Mongolia, among others. For this episode, we'll be talking about the OG, the Soviet Union. I'll be joined by guest Henry Hakamäki, immunobiologist, and as you likely already know, the co-host of the fantastic Guerilla History podcast, which is a huge inspiration for the show if you haven't already noticed. And our second guest is Salvatore Engel Di-Mauro, author of Socialist States and the Environment, Lessons for Eco-Socialist Futures. Salvatore is a professor at the Geography Department of SUNY New Paltz. In this episode, we'll be discussing their new English translation of Italian communist and historian Domenico Losurdo's landmark work, titled Stalin, The History and Critique of a Black Legend. This new translation is published by Iskra Books, and you can actually find this book on their website for free as a PDF. I've linked to it in the show notes. I also highly recommend, if you can, that you order a physical copy in paperback or hardcover. This is the first part of a longer discussion between the three of us. In this part, we talk about the general thrust of Domenico Losurdo's controversial book, what academic consensus has to say about the realities and myths surrounding historical presentations of Stalin, what a black legend even is, and how does Stalin's often distorted legacy impact left-wing movements today. Henry and Salvatore have had lengthy discussions about the translation process, who Domenico Losurdo is, which we don't really cover in detail in our discussion, so I've linked in the show notes again for other discussions to hear more about that. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a Patreon subscriber, you'll gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content, which are currently under development depending on when you're listening to this. So shout out to my patrons. If you're unable to contribute, no problem. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AES the Podcast. You can also subscribe to this show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to leave a review or even just a star rating if you have the time. I recommend also checking out the back catalog as well when you have the chance. And as always, you can really help out the show by engaging local workers' struggles, whatever form that may be. The opening interlude for this episode is an obituary of Joseph Stalin written in 1953 by the co-founder of the NAACP, civil rights activist, historian, sociologist extraordinaire, W.E.B. Du Bois.
Joseph Stalin was a great man. Few other men of the 20th century approach his stature. He was simple, calm, and courageous. He seldom lost his poise, pondered his problems slowly, made his decisions clearly and firmly, never yielded to ostentation nor coyly refrained from holding his rightful place with dignity. He was the son of a serf, but stood calmly before the great, without hesitation or nerves. But also, and this was the highest proof of his greatness, he knew the common man, felt his problems, followed his fate. Stalin was not a man of conventional learning. He was much more than that. He was a man who thought deeply, read understandingly, and listened to wisdom, no matter whence it came. He was attacked and slandered as few men of power have been, yet he seldom lost his courtesy and balance, nor did he let attack drive him from his convictions, nor induce him to surrender positions which he knew were correct. As one of the despised minorities of man, he first set Russia on the road to conquer race prejudice and made one nation out of its 140 groups without destroying their individuality. Then came intervention, the continuing threat of attack by all nations, halted by the Depression, only to be reopened by Hitlerism. It was Stalin who steered the Soviet Union between Scylla and Charybdis. Western Europe and the US were willing to betray her to fascism, and then had to beg her aid in the Second World War. A lesser man than Stalin would have demanded vengeance from Munich, but he had the wisdom to ask only justice for his fatherland. This Roosevelt granted, but Churchill held back. The British Empire proposed first to save itself in Africa and Southern Europe, while Hitler smashed the Soviets. The Second Front dawdled, but Stalin pressed unfalteringly ahead. He risked the utter ruin of socialism in order to smash the dictatorship of Hitler and Mussolini. After Stalingrad, the Western world did not know whether to weep or applaud. The cost of victory to the Soviet Union was frightful. To this day, the outside world has no dream of the hurt, the loss, and the sacrifices. For his calm, stern leadership here, if nowhere else, arises the deep worship of Stalin by the people of all the Russias. Then came the problem of peace. Hard as this was to Europe and America, it was far harder to Stalin and the Soviets. The conventional rulers of the world hated and feared him, and would have been only too willing to see the utter failure of this attempt at socialism. Here, Stalin showed his greatness. He neither cringed nor strutted. He never presumed, he never surrendered. He gained the friendship of Roosevelt and the respect of Churchill. He asked neither adulation nor vengeance. He was reasonable and conciliatory. But on what he deemed essential, he was inflexible. Such was the man who lies dead, still the butt of noisy jackals and of the ill-bred men of some parts of the distempered West. In life, he suffered under continuous and studied insult. He was forced to make bitter decisions on his own lone responsibility. His reward comes as the common man stands in solemn acclaim.
Glad and very honored to welcome both Henry Hakamäki and Salvatore Engel Di-Mauro to the show.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be on the show. Happy to talk about this work, and thank you for the invitation.
The honor is certainly mine. It's great to be invited. Thank you.
So we'll be talking about the historical construction of Stalin as analyzed in and beyond Lusurdo's Domenico Lusurdo's book, Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend, for which the two of you took on the gargantuan task of translating, and which is currently available for free in PDF version on Iskra Books. And of course, also I recommend people do order a copy. Paperback and hardback is available as well. And to learn more about what that specific process looked like of them translating it, who Domenico Losurdo is, I will, in the show notes, put some previous podcast discussions both parties have had on Guerilla History and other podcasts as well. So the aim of this episode seemed more of somewhat of a companion episode to the reading experience with a more of a free-form discussion, not exhaustive, but hopefully hone in on some specific concepts. Henry, I think it was in a previous discussion podcast you did, you mentioned how this book could have easily been like over 1,000 pages, but of course that wasn't the intent of the work. And so hopefully we can pull out some of those nuggets. So before we get started, was there anything either of the two of you want to say about your recent publication and translation of this book?
Well, the one thing I'll say is about the last point that you made, that this book could easily be more than 1,000 pages. That's absolutely the case. Even at the length that it's at, which is about 380 pages, we have over 1,000 in-text citations and about 346, I believe, if I remember my count correctly, references that are drawn from for those in-text citations. If this book wanted to be exhaustive in the analysis of the creation of the narrative of Stalin, it really would be more like 1,000 pages, and you would imagine about triple the amount of citations required to construct that sort of all-encompassing, comprehensive analysis, more than Lusurdo was able to do in this book. And also when you said that we're going to try to hit some of the topics in a non-exhaustive way, similarly, if we wanted to talk in about the depth that we would need to kind of deconstruct the creation and mythology of Stalin for good and for bad in the way that Lusurdo lays out in this work, we would need at least, a 10-hour long episode to really, start to actually get under the layers of that creation. But in the time that we have, we'll do our best.
If I can add to that, thank you, Henry. Just to perhaps preface the discussion by saying that the book should be also read as part of a greater project that Losurdo had embarked on, that is to contribute to reconstructing a communist left in general in countries like Italy. And so this is a process. It's part of that larger process, because there are other books, one of which is coming out soon, Western Marxism, and the other one that me and Henry hopefully will be working on
Maybe
soon
keep
enough
that one
in
a
a
secret
year or
since we
two.
haven't
Yeah,
signed any
exactly.
contracts on that one yet.
Absolutely. That we're hoping we'll be working on it. That would be yet another book that would be an accompaniment to what we are discussing now, what we translated together.
Actually, to add one more thing, and Salvatore brings out a very important point that this work really is a political project in many ways. It actually goes beyond even Lusurdo. The project of bringing it into English and the project of the publisher that we went through, Iskra Books, also is a political project. That's why this book is available for free as a PDF, because Salvatore and I and Iskra Books, we care most about having this information available to as many people as possible, because as we mentioned, for Lusurdo, this was also a political project to reconstruct and strengthen the left movements in countries like Italy or like the West more generally. Lusurdo's task in doing this is to do these sorts of works like Stalin, like liberalism, like Western Marxism, like this book that we will hopefully be working on in the very near future, which will remain unnamed at the present time. This was Lusurdo's project, but this book was not widely available in English yet. Yes, there have been sort of bootleg translations of this book to varying levels of success. I know the Lusurdo estate was not exactly happy with the way that those previous, like I said, more or less bootleg translations. That's not to say that they shouldn't have been done. People did want to access this book in English, and it was, a valiant effort in trying to undertake that in the capacity that the previous translators, like the late David Ferreira, were able to do. But what we wanted to do is to put an authorized translation together that worked from the actual source Italian in a way that was as accurate to what Lusurdo was saying as possible, and then to make that available to as many people as possible. So this book is printed more or less at cost. So if you want the print edition, which I recommend, by the way, you can footnote it and all of that, but also they just look really great. So the listeners won't be able to see me hold up the copies that I have, the paperback or the hardcover, but, look it up. It's a really great looking thing. But we wanted to make sure that as many people have it as possible. So even knowing that this book is printed at cost, we want to also make sure that the PDF is free. Anybody who has an electronic device that has the capacity to open PDFs is going to be able to access this work. And that was really important to us and really important to Iskra Books because, again, this is a political project in many ways, and more than just what Lusurdo was undertaking. That was also our goal as well.
So starting from the cover, which I will say is probably one of the coolest book covers I've ever seen, if you guys ever create a poster for that, I think they'd be interested in it because it is beautiful artwork.
I think that that'll probably be worked on at some point. Ben Stanka at Iskra Books is the one who put that together.
Yeah, I look forward to that. So beautiful cover. The title of the book is Stalin, History and Critique of a Black Legend. And so the term Black Legend in itself is a phrase. It's not just two words put together, but it has a deeper meaning than just those two separate words. And so, of course, to find a good definition of that phrase, I went to the all-knowing Wikipedia, which sometimes does have good definitions, quick summaries of concepts. So Black Legend is a historiographical phenomenon in which a sustained trend in historical writing or biased reporting and introduction of fabricated, exaggerated, and or decontextualized facts is directed against particular persons, nations, or institutions with the intention of creating a distorted and uniquely inhuman image of them while hiding their positive contributions to history. So with that said, why Stalin? Why is Stalin the I don't say the victim, but why are Black legends attributed to Stalin?
It's not really about Stalin in the end. It is about vilifying an entire historical movement, communist movements in general. That is really what is at stake, and that is, I think, has been the point of the effort to, at least on the part of capitalist powers, to create a distorted image of a distorted construct with respect to Stalin, but also to and we've discussed this in other venues, that to reduce the effort of millions into the actions and foibles of an individual. So that I think that's part of the process, maybe not necessarily intentional. And then there's the other aspect, which unfortunately involves also part of the left, that maybe we can discuss a bit later, that has to do with legitimate conflicts within the communist movements as well, that regrettably have degenerated in some respects over time, but also already by the 30s into a sort of a very poorly thought out strategy, to say the least, that instead of countering anti-communist propaganda has, in some respects, made the matter even worse, or has enhanced the powers that should be fought. I'm not sure, Henry, if you want to start from there, or because there's quite a lot to say.
There really is. I mean, that is the whole crux of the work, in all honesty. But just to add in, I guess, briefly at this stage, because we'll hit more of it as we go, that this Black legend is constructed by various forces and for various reasons. It's constructed by right-wing forces and liberal forces in order to vilify socialism and communism more generally. Just think, I'm sure, we're speaking in English. Many of the listeners are going to be listening in Western countries. Think about how the discussion of Stalin usually goes. I'm sure Stalin has come up in conversation with you at some point in your life, listeners, whether or not you were directly talking about Stalin or whether Stalin's name just came up in some conversation. How is Stalin's name always evoked? When his name comes up, it is always to say socialism is totalitarian, it is evil, it is brutal. Stalin was socialist. All socialism is Stalin. Stalin embodies all socialism, and therefore all socialism is bad and it's inherently going to be brutal. That's how Stalin is evoked. That is part of this. It is a political narrative that is presented in order to vilify a political movement that runs contrary to the system in which we operate. We're operating under a system of global capitalism, neoliberal capitalism for the most part, imperialist capitalism, and that runs across the globe. It's not just in individual countries, but there's a system that interconnects these countries within this world system, in this capitalist world system. Socialism is contrary to this system. It's not saying like a liberal tradition within capitalism versus a conservative tradition within capitalism. No, socialism aims to undermine this tradition and this system entirely and to construct a new world. So, of course, the forces that are invested in perpetuating the system that we're living under are going to do whatever it takes to perpetuate that system. It's only natural. You can't really blame them. It's their system. They're going to do what it takes to perpetuate it. And Stalin is an exemplar of an alternative system, or the attempt to create an alternative system. And for many years was the leader of the leading light in this attempt to construct an alternative system. So the capitalist forces are always utilizing the name of Stalin as kind of a canard, as this individual represents what socialism is. Nowadays, we're also seeing other names evoked. Mao was also evoked in the past, but now, of course, think about, Venezuela. Venezuela's name is thrown in any conversation when the word socialism comes up as, look, you want socialism, you want whatever, free healthcare, it doesn't matter. Even if it's, we're talking about social democratic welfare reforms, the first thing that comes up in conversation oftentimes today is Venezuela. But for the last several decades, Stalin's name has come up. Oh, you want government subsidized education? You must love Stalin, and therefore you must love totalitarianism and gulags and executions and et cetera, et cetera. It's really a ridiculous narrative that's presented. But as Salvatore also mentioned and kind of hinted at the end, there's a long tradition of very public and internecine fighting within the left itself. So even if you're looking within political ideologies that do want to deconstruct capitalism, I'm not saying that all of the attempts to vilify Stalin are done by capitalists or capitalists in disguise. There are certainly legitimate socialists and other left forces, anarchists, whatever, that truly believe in the necessity to dismantle capitalism and replace it with something new. But they do have, and in many cases, legitimate qualms with the legacy of Stalin. But one of the issues that we see is that this narrative, this Black legend, has been constructed by capitalist forces and then has been picked up by these other left groups that have, like I said, in many cases, legitimate qualms about things that were done by the Stalin government in the Soviet Union in order to push their own specific brand of political ideology, even on the left. And what ends up happening is because of how public it is, it just ends up feeding back into the popular consciousness of what Stalin was, not who Stalin was, what Stalin was, because we often talk about this dehumanizing nature of this narrative. It feeds into this popular narrative of what Stalin was, what he represented, and why he is irredeemable in the eyes of the broader public, because you get that narrative from both right-wing forces and left-wing forces that are not amenable to Marxism, Leninism specifically.
One thing that came to mind as both of you were speaking was, how this entire concept of socialism, or socialism as it existed in the 20th century, is kind of imputed into Stalin's person, and how that, Lusurdo points this out in his book, that it's kind of an irony in the sense that rather than Stalin being seen as being the figure in a cult of personality where he's responsible for everything that is good and everything that is working, and he's the ideal, they turn him into kind of a negative cult of personality, where Stalin is now responsible for everything negative that occurs, and he's the overarching being, so to speak, that sits at the top of the system. Yeah, I just wanted to point that out. One of the many, of course, points that Lusurdo makes in his work. Another point I wanted to make as well is that I think that sometimes people may get the perception that Lusurdo's work, or any other work that kind of tries to give a more nuanced perspective of Stalin, is kind of out of sync with scholarship that specifically focuses on Stalin. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong here, if you've seen something different. But from what I've seen from scholarship from the past 10 years or so, I was reading a book the other day called Revisioning Stalin and Stalinism. Came out in 2021, and it's a collection of different authors. I believe most of them are liberal. They pretty much make the argument that much of the way that Stalin was presented during the Cold War were just outright fabrications. Say, for example, the idea that Stalin, and Lusurdo talks about this in his book, the idea that Stalin was a terrible military leader and that he totally screwed up the war effort, when, now since the archives have opened up, and even before that, there's so many sources that point out the reality that is, in fact, not true. And I did want to actually take a quote from this book, Revising Stalin and Stalinism, because I think it's key to understand. And so this is kind of a summary of current scholarship on Stalin in general. So it says, the stark Cold War and totalitarian binary has been shown to be nuanced, and many myths have been undermined. We now have a much more subtle and varied palette of colors making up the broad picture. The emerging portrait, however, is far from definitive. There's still a long way to go. Old myths still die hard, especially in the public imagination, but many major strides have been made. This might be thought of as a revisionism, and is sometimes referred to as such, but that may not be the best terminology. It is not a process of overturning a deeply researched conventional view, which is what revisionism usually is, but rather the preliminary establishment of an evidence-based view detailing the contours of Russia's experience of so-called Stalinism and the emergence of a better grounded interpretation of Stalin. And the quote goes on to say, and this is a point that both of you have made in previous discussions, and Lusurdo himself makes in his work, that this must not be, and I'm continuing the quote here, which says, this must not be confused with a whitewash or a form of Stalin denial. Although old Cold War hawks were not slow to suggest that, there is no suggestion in this new historiography that the cruelties did not matter. To establish an archivally based figure approaching 700,000 executions rather than many millions is not denial, it's writing history. So did either of you want to kind of respond to this idea of Lusurdo's work in the bigger context of scholarship?
Yeah, I can be brief. This is even outside of Lusurdo specifically, and perhaps Salvatore, you can try to, put us back onto the right path. But just to start off by saying that, again, to echo those sentiments, actually looking at history is not whitewashing history or making a revisionist history. What we have to understand is that we have to be careful of dogmatism. And dogmatism can run in two ways. It can run in more than two ways, but let's focus on two ways right here. One way is that you become dogmatic in your view that everything Stalin did was good, that Stalin made no mistakes, that Stalin was in some way exempt from the fact that human beings are not perfect creatures and therefore we make mistakes. That is dogmatism, and that is wrong. Stalin made many mistakes, as all humans do. Now, of course, when you're leading a country that is under assault continuously by imperialist forces, the mistakes you make are going to be rather public and they're going to be rather large. But the point is that Stalin was a man, and men make mistakes. And I've said this many times on other interviews that we've talked about this book and elsewhere, that if you claim you haven't made mistakes, you're just wrong, and you need to, reflect a little bit. You can't have this dogmatic view that Stalin did not make mistakes. But unfortunately, we see, which is much, much more common, many scale of magnitude more common than the dogmatic group that says Stalin was perfect, he didn't make mistakes, is that there is a large group that says Stalin was evil and everything that Stalin did was evil inherently. Even when he did something good, there was some malintent that was present under the surface. And this is a group that encompasses a large proportion of society. And this group then becomes resistant to these newer analyses that look at actual archival evidence that has come out since the 1990s when the archives have been opened. They become resistant to this evidence that shows a lot of these narratives that were put out about Stalin are outright false. One of the things that Lusurdo talks about in this work, not nearly as in depth as he could and probably should have, was Khrushchev's secret speech. This is still used today as a citation for evidence of Stalin's brutality and inhumanity, despite the fact that we now know that most of the claims were either outright fabricated or were gross exaggerations that whitewash the role of Khrushchev himself within these same events. This is widely understood within circles of individuals who have utilized the archival data, but within popular society, this document, the secret speech, which again was not supposed to be a secret, listeners, if you're not familiar with the secret speech, it was a political move to make this what was supposed to be an internal dialogue within the 20th Party Congress of the Soviet Union, to make this public. It was to vilify Stalin, to reduce how people thought of Stalin, and that was to create space for the new incoming administration, the Khrushchev administration, to be able to say, look, we are the true defenders of socialism, and we're going to clean up this terrible legacy of our predecessor, which at that point was incredibly popular. By the way, Stalin is still very popular here. I live in Russia. There was a poll that recently came out within the last couple of weeks, found he was the third most popular leader amongst Russians that were polled today. The only people that polled higher than him were Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. I think Peter the Great was first and Catherine the Great was second. But then Stalin was third with a 61% approval rating. I don't remember the disapproval rating. It was about 15% or something like that, like a very, very small percentage. That's kind of the narrative that's here, even though that in Russia itself, as with all of the Soviet countries at that time, they were also being propagandized with false narratives like those that were presented within the secret speech. But it's not only within the secret speech that we see this. We see forces that are in the West, like the government of the United States, the CIA, intentionally misinforming the public to try to create this narrative around Stalin, to do these sort of political moves that I described earlier on. And I think that's something that exemplifies this. And I apologize, listeners. I know, Tony, you're putting the links to the other interviews that we've done in the show notes. So I've cited this in every interview that we've done about this book, but I'm going to cite it again because I really do think it's important. It's not in Lusurdo's book, but it's very easy to find. This is a declassified internal memo from the CIA. It's titled Comments on the Change in Soviet Leadership, came out just after Stalin's death. And what we see here is that the CIA knew that the narrative that they were presenting, they being part of the United States imperial hegemonic superstructure, kind of putting this out into broader society, they knew that what they were putting out for the American public and the Western public more generally was false, but that it served some sort of purpose. And so without further ado, to read the first point of this internal memo, which again, it's important to note that it's an internal memo. This was not meant to be going out to the broader public for some propaganda. This was what the CIA analysts were themselves understanding of the situation. And it's also worth mentioning, there are smart people at the CIA, evil but smart. So point number one, even in Stalin's time, there was collective leadership. the Western idea, and remember the Western idea that they're themselves putting out there for Western consumption. The Western idea of a dictator within the communist setup is exaggerated. Misunderstandings on that subject are caused by lack of comprehension of the real nature and organization of the communist power structure. Stalin, although holding wide powers, was merely the captain of a team, and it seems obvious that Khrushchev will be the new captain. However, it does not appear that any of the present leaders will rise to the stature of Lenin and Stalin, so that it will be safer to assume that developments in Moscow will be along the lines of what is called collective leadership, unless Western policies force the Soviets to streamline their power organization. The present situation is the most favorable from the point of view of upsetting the communist dictatorship since the death of Stalin. So what do we see from this? I think that the listeners can kind of infer the point that I'm making here, which is that they know that they're propagandizing. They know that what the narrative that they're putting out is not an accurate narrative, but they don't care. Why is that? We know why that is. Anyway, I've kind of dithered along too long. Salvatore, feel free to hop in. I'm sure you have a lot to say on this as well.
You've been quite exhaustive. What I would like to add in terms of what you were saying, Tony, about with respect to the revising of Stalin, because again, it gets one of the things that has not changed in this revising since the a more serious sort of historical research has been occurring since the 90s, in part because of the archives being open, but also in part because it's kind of obsolescent to maintain this kind of propaganda. But one thing that has not changed is this very bourgeois understanding of history. It keeps returning to emphasizing an individual as if that is how the world changes. And if one is serious, and I should hope that on the left most would be serious about changing society, the focus is on social forces. It's not just on individuals. It's on understanding social relations and how to change social relations, right? So it is curious that also historians on the left continue along this path of classical liberalism in emphasizing individual activities as if they are the make-all and end-all of history. So that's one aspect sort of you reminded me of. And with respect to Losurdo should not be, in that regard, the work that he has done on Stalin should, in that regard, not be beyond the mainstream, and yet it still is. And I suspect that the reason why it is because he's not emphasizing Stalin, the monarch, that changes the world for the worse or for the better, whichever perspective one wants to take, but focuses on the social relations that produce at various scales, the social relations, especially at the national and international scale. That's really the emphasis, that produced this narrative with respect to Stalin standing in for socialism or communism or what have you, or from the perspective of some components of the socialist or communist left, what communist movement should not be. Stalin stands in relation to that as a construct. I wanted to also bring out something else with respect to how Losurdo can be situated in this revisiting of history. One thing that kind of struck me early on, some years ago, is even before reading Losurdo, but Losurdo really made me much more conscious of it, is that there's such a incredible switch in terms of how the image of Stalin is constructed. It is striking how it was possible to completely flip the understanding of the Stalin government within a few years after World War II, from great hero to great villain. And W.B. Du Bois, for example, praised Stalin in 1953 upon Stalin's death, and it wasn't like he was alone in praising Stalin. There were major figures, and Losurdo brings this out. The whole issue about the archives is also suspect as opening things up, and therefore now we can debunk all these mythologies. These mythologies were very much debunkable by the 1940s and 50s because it is not possible to have someone who is praised as a hero one year and then the next year a complete, maniac. It's just that's one thing that people should think about. How is that possible? How is it possible that even on the left they've fallen for this? At least in the West, because it should have been self-evident that this is just very much an artifice of propaganda.
I just want to add one quick thing that is related to something that Salvatore said, and I realize we haven't really laid out yet, but will be useful for listeners who are considering picking up this book and reading it, or grabbing the free PDF and reading it, is that Lusurdo and this work should not be considered as subversive as they are. This book has something of a reputation of being like way out on the fringes of understanding of Stalin, and that he's the only person who has ever had this view, and he's trying to undertake some project that is unique to him, that is Lusurdo. This book shouldn't be considered like this at all. It certainly is written by a Marxist-Leninist, and nobody's trying to dispute that. Lusurdo is very clear about his political affiliations. And of course, everybody writes from their own perspective. So this is written from the perspective of a Marxist-Leninist philosopher, just as people will often claim that, this book was written by a Marxist-Leninist and therefore it can't be an honest accounting of Stalin. Well, okay, are we going to claim that, Timothy Snyder doesn't have his own ideological, preconceptions when he comes to, telling the story of the Soviet Union at that point of time? Of course not. Timothy Snyder is a, blood-dripping anti-communist. So, what's the difference here? He's going to be writing from his perspective. Lusurdo's writing from his perspective. That doesn't mean that they're automatically wrong. You can disagree with them. This book is not a complete exoneration of Stalin, which I think is often what it's portrayed as when people are discussing it online. And I will mention, discussed by people who have not read it, because you cannot come away from this book thinking that if you have actually read it. I can't tell you how many times Lusurdo in this book writes the terror of, the barbarity of, these sorts of adjectives to describe, well, I guess in that case it would be, a noun, but in any case, to describe some event or some decision that was undertaken by Stalin or the Stalin government. He is not whitewashing many of these things. He is, of course, saying there were lies that were told, and when necessary, he is pointing out what was a lie. He's also saying some of these things are grossly exaggerated, and of course, he's pointing out when this is happening. And he's also pointing out there was a mistake here and there was a mistake there. That's not to say that this is whataboutism, like, Winston Churchill did this and Stalin did this, therefore everything's fine because both sides were doing it. No, the point is to construct this analysis of why is Stalin vilified for this when other people have it completely swept under the rug. It's to take some sort of honest accounting of these decisions that were made, whether it was a lie, whether it was an exaggerated propaganda, whether it was something that other people were doing and were not being vilified in the same way that Stalin were for the exact same kind of thing within studies of this period of time. Or, Lusurdo is willing to concede that there was many mistakes, as anybody should be willing to concede. Anybody that has power in any sort of capacity is going to make mistakes. And in this book, it's no different. Lusurdo is honest about that. So this kind of idea that this book is this weird, on the fringes, complete exoneration, almost hagiography of Stalin is completely false. And anybody who reads the work is not going to come away from reading it thinking that. Of course, it's broadly positive about Stalin. It is written from a Marxist-Leninist perspective. There's no denying that. But to claim that it's, something that it's not just shows that they haven't read the work. And so for listeners who are afraid that, reading this work is not going to be valuable because it's just going to be a hagiography and whatever, you don't even have to read the book if it's just a hagiography. You just say Stalin was good in everything. He didn't make any mistake. That's not what this book is. So do pick it up. Even if you have views that are more negative about Stalin, this will still be a very useful book for you because, as Salvatore pointed out in his first answer, ultimately this book is truly not about Stalin. Stalin is used as a case example here, but the idea that is put forth in the construction of a Black legend to vilify a political project is a broader one. And so, regardless of your specific thoughts on Stalin, do pick it up because this is not that hagiography that it's often presented as.
Thank you for that, both of you. The book, and I think even this might be misconception as well, is that the book isn't like a biography of Stalin. Rather, not at all. So rather it, addresses or analyzes different constructs, historical constructs of Stalin. Salvatore, you'd mentioned this, flip switch from the way Stalin was presented during World War II to after it. One example Lusurdo points out is in regards to anti-Semitism. And this kind of blew my mind when he, when he pointed it out. Prior to World War II and the rise of Nazism, the Soviet Union was, of course, there's the allegation by those in the West, particularly by capitalists, by anti-Semites, that the Soviet Union was, and communism in general, was some ploy created by Jewish people to either enslave Europeans or something of that sort. Stalin and Lenin and all those people were viewed as being essentially puppets of this larger Jewish conspiracy that even Marx, going back all those years too, was a part of. And because Jewish people were seen as the kind of like this biggest amorphous threat, communism had to be attached to it. Following World War II, however, now that Nazism was the big enemy of the West, and Nazism was specifically tied to anti-Semitism as one of their main tenets, Stalin now had to be imputed with those same characteristics of now being an anti-Semite, because Stalin is now our worst enemy. So that kind of flip was, is I think a very clear example of how these constructs of Stalin are presented. So moving into looking at like a specific area of concepts in regards to how Stalin is presented, it's in one of his works. It isn't actually in this book, but he wrote a short article called Stalin and Hitler, Twin Brothers or Mortal Enemies. And he covers some of the same content, of course, in A Black Legend. And in it, he makes the case that that the Soviet Union under Stalin essentially was the lead of a huge anti-colonial, decolonial movement, the biggest, essentially, effort that's ever existed. And this kind of flew in the face of everything that I'd understood. Before I think I moved to the left, I was very interested in civil rights history, in anti-racism, and things of that sort. And I always kind of assumed that, like, say I'm in Canada. Canadians kind of supplant their own history with American history, so you learn about things that are happening there. So the civil rights movement, MLK, and it's as if these movements only existed in the U.S. and kind of spread from the U.S. As in MLK was kind of, say for example, person kind of inspired these other movements that were happening around the world. When in reality, actions that he would push forward in the U.S. Such as affirmative action and many other programs like that, had already been implemented in the Soviet Union by the 60s for about 40 years. So that kind of, it's one of those things that, doesn't get talked about enough. Did either of you have any comments in regards to the anti-colonial, construction of Stalin? Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for the rest of my discussion with Henry and Salvatore, where we talk about the Soviet Union and Stalin as the forefront of a global anti-colonial movement. Till next time.